A tiny cabin stands alone in the ancient forest. Made of white pine, the chinks between the logs daubed with clay, it is a single 12 by 12-foot room. Inside, a low bed, a table and chair, a cast iron stove in which a handful of sticks slowly whiten to embers. The cabin is new built, but already seems worn and oppressed, perhaps a reflection of its sole occupant. Outside the rough-hewn door, a narrow circle of bare ground has been carved out of the wilderness. But the poplar seedlings and thick underbrush are encroaching, greedy to claw back what has been their land since time immemorial. Beyond the cabin, beyond the clearing, stretch endless miles of red and white pine, weed-choked bogs, pristine lakes, and quiet streams. But there are few people here. Certainly no neighbor close enough to observe, on this warm, early evening in June 1907, the absence of smoke rising from the tin pipe chimney at supper time. And as the shadows grow deeper beneath the tall pines, and the pair of small cabin windows become black, sightless eyes without the warm light of a kerosene lamp to defy the darkness, there is no one to notice. Yet high overhead, a breeze stirs the top of the trees, creating a haunting sound like a sigh or an insistent whisper. Where is Grandma Chase? A lonely, unsettled part of the country. The area of northern Minnesota, now comprising the Paul Bunyan State Forest, was open to homesteading in the 1860s, but it wasn't until the Red River Lumber Company began logging the region in the 1890s that small settlements began to spring up in the widening patches of cleared land. One of these was called Yola, located along Birch Creek in Lake George Township, Hubbard County. The date of its founding isn't clear, but by 1903 it boasted its own post office. Still, apart from the seasonal logging camps, there were never more than a handful of settlers living in the area in the first years of the 20th century. One of those was the Chase family. The 1905 census records that one Eugene M. Chase, age 53, headed a household that included his wife Nettie, age 39, sons Fred, age 9, John, age 5, and Charles, age 2. And there was also Emmeline Chase, 86 years old, living with her son and his family. For a woman of such advanced age to be living in such isolated and primitive conditions is remarkable. It's even more surprising to discover that 2 years later, at age 88, we find Mrs. Chase living on her own in a tiny cabin apart from her family, alone in the forest. That was the situation on July 11, 1907, when startling news reached the offices of the Pioneer newspaper in Bemidji, a booming lumber town some 18 miles from Yola, and was duly relayed to the paper's readers.
Aged woman is missing. Foul play is suspected. Mrs. Emily Chase, known as Grandma Chase, disappeared from her home at Yola June 27th. Diligent search fails to find her.
The paper reported that
the entire neighborhood of Yola and the north half of Hubbard County is greatly exercised over the mysterious disappearance of Grandmother Chase, an aged resident of this community.
According to the Pioneer, the old lady had been residing alone on an 80-acre homestead 4 miles west of Yola. It was an isolated habitation, with the nearest neighbor being half a mile distant. It was said that on Tuesday, June 27th, Mrs. Chase had walked to the home of a neighbor, J.W. Spaulding, whose homestead was 1.5 miles through the woods from her own cabin. Late that afternoon, she was spotted on her way home by another local, W.J. Church, who lived 3/4 mile from her property. He recalled it was about 2 hours before sunset as he watched the elderly woman pass by. Several days later, on July 2nd, the paper said, Mrs. Chase's son Eugene and his wife Nettie, who lived in adjacent Schoolcraft Township, brought food and water to the cabin, only to find it empty and quiet. Strangely, the couple did not pause to make much of a search for their loved one, later explaining they assumed she was visiting a neighbor. Later that day, neighbor Church, not having seen anything of the woman for some days, made his way to her place. There he found a skunk had gotten into the cabin, and the provisions left by Eugene and Nettie lay untouched on the table where the couple had left them. The only item he noted as missing was a silver pail that usually stood near the door, used by Mrs. Chase to fetch water from a nearby swamp. Concerned, Mr. Church walked to the home of another settler some 3/4 of a mile distant, Irvin Clapp, to alert him to Mrs. Chase's absence. It being late in the day, the two men decided to wait until the morrow to investigate further. Early the next morning, the two men called at the homestead of the old woman's son, where they found only Nettie and the children at home. Eugene had gone to help move a log-driving camp, she told them, and as for her mother-in-law, she professed no knowledge of her whereabouts. At this news, Church and Clapp raised the alarm in the settlement, and a search party of 30 men was organized, but nothing was found.
The old lady's claim is in a lonely and unsettled part of the country.
The newspaper told its readers, adding that,
So thick and dense is the underbrush which covers the land that it is a very difficult matter for anyone to pass through the timber.
The paper expressed skepticism that the pioneer woman, nearing her 90th year, would have wandered far from her doorstep. Her several-mile journey by foot the last day she was seen notwithstanding, the newspaper described Mrs. Chase as
very feeble.
So where could she be? According to the article, there were dark murmurings in Yola that the woman had not gone missing of her own doing. Neighbors whispered that Grandma Chase had been treated harshly by Eugene and his wife, her only kin in the region, and that
reliable witnesses will swear that threats had been made against the old lady's life.
Highly educated, devoted to literature, and religious. Who was the missing woman, Emmeline Chase? She was born around 1819 in New York State to English immigrant parents with the surname Haggerty. It was said of her that she was highly educated, devoted to literature and religious, an acquaintance of many of the best families of New York, including Russell Sage, a financier and railroad tycoon who was one of the wealthiest men in the country. While little record can be found of her early life, by 1850 the U.S. Census showed she had married Nathan R. Chase, a shoemaker 10 years her senior, and they lived with their son Oscar, age 5, along with several others in the city of Troy, New York. A decade later, the family had relocated to Decorah, Iowa, and the household had expanded to include another son, Eugene, listed as 9 in the 1860 census. There, her husband worked first as a tanner and eventually became connected to a prosperous wholesale firm. The Chase family would have enjoyed a comfortable life as prominent citizens in their new home. Sadly, their older son Oscar died in Indiana in 1884 at age just 38 of unknown causes. Emmeline remained in the family home at Decorah for at least the next 25 years, as she and Nathan were listed in the 1885 census when she would have been in her mid-60s and her husband 75. How was it, then, that this refined and genteel lady, accustomed to comfort and society, came to be living alone in her very old age in a rustic cabin far from friends and familiar surroundings, until she vanished without a trace in those deep and wild woods? According to news reports around the time of her disappearance,
sometime after the death of her husband, Grandma Chase was persuaded by her son Eugene, who had staked a claim in Schoolcraft Township, to sell her home and come north to live with him. At some point thereafter, the elderly woman left or was turned out of her son's home and went to live a life of loneliness and privation in the woods.
The Bemidji Pioneer, which continued its coverage of the story through July, reported that neighbors said she was neglected by her son, never fully supplied with food, and had to get her own wood and water. On July 12th, every settler in the area joined in a search for her, covering many rods in every direction from the cabin, with no result. While settlers were beating the bushes for the missing woman, suspicions of foul play grew.
Many of the neighbors are outspoken in their belief that the son and his wife have been instrumental in getting the old lady out of the way.
The Pioneer told its readers, adding that
neither the son nor daughter-in-law exhibit much interest in the absence of the old lady.
By July 16th, with still no sign of Emmeline, the Pioneer reported,
the belief is becoming general that the aged woman has been murdered and her body concealed.
Suspicions were only heightened when it was revealed that Contrary to what was originally believed, J.W. Church was not the last person to see Emmeline Chase alive when he observed her walking home on June 27. In fact, it developed that on June 28th, Emmeline had visited her son's homestead where she found her daughter-in-law and a man named Finnegan alone in the house. The children had gone to meet their father, who was returning home from Bemidji. Emmeline joined her daughter-in-law and visitor for noon dinner, during which the two women had words, according to Hetty. She said her mother-in-law started for home around 2 p.m. And that, it appears, is truly the last time Emmeline Chase was seen alive. A cold-blooded murder. Meanwhile, her son Eugene offered conflicting statements on his own whereabouts that day, first saying he returned home by 2:30 p.m. that afternoon, then pushing his arrival back to 4:30 p.m. While Eugene participated in the township-wide search for his mother, the Pioneer reported that
his indifference was very noticeable and has aroused the ire of every resident of Yola and the country surrounding to such an extent that there are ugly mutterings as to Chase having had a hand in the disappearance of his mother.
When the Chase family traveled to Bemidji the day after the search to attend a circus performance in that town, local sentiments against the clan only became more inflamed. The growing unrest finally gained the attention of local authorities, and on July 18th, Hubbard County Attorney C.E. Dampier made a bold assertion to the Bemidji Pioneer.
In the disappearance of Mrs. Emily Chase at Yola, the authorities of Hubbard County are, I believe, confronted with a cold-blooded murder and hiding of the crime by putting the body away in some secluded, unfrequented spot or sinking it in some nearby lake.
The attorney, accompanied by Hubbard County Sheriff Daniel Petrie and Deputy Sheriff Thomas Finney, traveled from the county seat at Park Rapids, some 25 miles away, to Yola to investigate the case. They were said to have made a diligent inquiry of the relatives of the missing woman as to her whereabouts, and led yet another close search of Grandma Chase's home. They subsequently declared themselves baffled by the disappearance of the aged settler and authorized the offer of a $100 reward for the recovery of her body. J.W. Spaulding, the neighbor who Emmeline had visited the day before her disappearance, told the paper that Yola residents
intend to drag every lake, stream, and swamp in the vicinity.
The Pioneer solemnly informed its readers that
authorities have in their possession some facts that will warrant criminal action against certain parties at Yola in case the body is found.
Missing woman is found. A startling development in the case was published on July 21st in the Minneapolis Journal, which reported that, according to sources in Akeley, Minnesota, a village 30 miles from Yola, Mrs. Emily Chase had been found by neighbors nearly a month after her disappearance. The paper stated that the old woman had slept in the woods and lived on wild fruit for many days, and when found, had been wandering from cabin to cabin seeking assistance. The Bemidji Pioneer followed up a day later with its headline,
"Report that Mrs. Chase was found is incorrect."
The paper broke the news that the article in the Minneapolis Journal was wholly erroneous. In an era where rivalry between press organs was fierce and even vicious, the Pioneer pointed the finger of blame at an Akeley pressman for the fake news.
The farmers living in the vicinity of this place are considerably incensed at a report which has been circulated as coming from here, and which undoubtedly had its origin in the mind of a newspaper correspondent in Akeley, to the effect that Mrs. Emily Chase, known as Grandma Chase, has been found.
The Pioneer assured its readers that Emmeline remained missing,
despite the most diligent search on the part of at least 4 different posses,
and that
not the slightest clue has been found as to where the old lady is or what direction she may have gone.
The paper concluded darkly,
how the report that she had been found originated is not definitely known, but it is the belief here that it was inspired by someone who has been instrumental in causing the absence of Mrs. Chase. The belief is becoming almost universal here that Mrs. Chase has been killed and her body burned or otherwise secreted.
Disappearance of Yola people still a mystery. After the false report of Emmeline's safe recovery in July, The mystery faded from local headlines and life returned to a semblance of normalcy at Yola until late September, when news of another unexplained disappearance in the same sparsely settled area created a fresh wave of anxiety and intrigue. On September 20th, Frederick Seafort, age 84, a Civil War veteran awarded a military pension in 1891, disappeared from his isolated claim near Yola. Like Mrs. Chase before him, Frederick Seafort was searched for by his neighbors, and there were rumors of foul play. He was last seen in the Yola post office, then never again. When the Bemidji Pioneer recapped the status of the two disappearances that fall, it was more circumspect about suggesting that either settler had been a victim of crime.
The belief is prevalent that Mr. Seafort wandered into the woods and perished, and that his body will be recovered someday.
The report stated, adding,
The two cases of disappearance in almost the same locality look strange, but there is no positive proof that there was foul play in either case.
In August, hope of solving the mystery of Grandma Chase's disappearance was fading quickly. The Bemidji Pioneer reported on August 12th that
it has now become almost a settled belief of the farmers living in the vicinity of Yola that the body of Mrs. Chase is lying in a swamp, which is known as the flowage, and that the remains will never be recovered.
What locals called the flowage was a floating bog covering many miles in the area of the Chase cabin. E.R. Dampier of Akeley, the county attorney who previously offered $100 for the recovery of Grandma Chase's body, promised that the search for her would not be abandoned, but admitted that he was
inclined to the belief that the missing woman, if ever found, will be accidentally stumbled upon in a strange place.
And there the matter rested, like the undiscovered remains of Emily Chase, as summer turned to autumn in Minnesota's deep woods, and the biting wind whistling through the brittle reeds of the flowage sang an eerie dirge for the lost. Woman eaten by wildcat. The breakthrough came on November 21st, 1907, when a party of deer hunters discovered a body at the edge of a tamarack swamp about a mile from Emmeline Chase's cabin. The hunters immediately contacted authorities, and the county coroner, one Dr. Irish, was dispatched to catalog the scene. The scattered remains and relics he found appeared to tell a poignant story of the final day in the life of a woman who had once known comfort, civility, and the company of glittering society, but who came to her end alone, impoverished, and, if local rumors are to be believed, unmourned by her own son. The first item noted on the scene was a worn rubber overshoe half sunk in the boggy ground beside a fallen log. A bit further on, scraps of a skirt were snagged in the dense undergrowth. Nearby lay an old-fashioned hood in which a considerable amount of hair and a pair of false teeth were cradled. Close to the edge of the swamp lay the remains of an apron and a pair of tin pails, one half filled with water, and the other containing a collection of birch bark pieces of the kind that Mrs. Chase used to kindle her small stove. According to local news reports, the body was mostly decomposed, though the absence of certain internal organs, notably the stomach, were noted. The incompleteness of the remains prompted a reporter for the Hartford, Minnesota Herald to suggest that Grandma Chase had been the prey of a lynx or other big woodland cat, while others hinted that the absence of much of the body was evidence that she had been killed elsewhere, dismembered, and her body parts hidden in various dark and unvisited places in the deep woods. However they got there, all that was left of Mrs. Emmeline Chase amounted to 23 bones, which were gathered and presented to her son Eugene in a sack. What he did with them is unknown. So how did Grandma Chase meet her end? A predator is certainly possible. Even today, black bears are not uncommon in the area, and before the land was cleared by loggers and tilled by farmers, the deep woods harbored other large carnivores like wolves, lynx, and the occasional cougar. Perhaps, as she knelt by the side of the swamp, scooping a little brackish water into her pail or gathering papery strips of bark from fallen limbs, she had no idea that narrowed eyes were on her, a hidden form with muscles tensed and quivering in anticipation of attack. If so, we can only hope the end came swiftly. Or maybe Emmeline Chase, 88 years old and tired from a 1.5-mile journey from her cabin through the dense woods, simply sat down there at the edge of the swamp and never got up again. Those would seem more likely explanations than that a penniless woman was murdered by her own kin or a stranger and carried far into the wilderness to lay unburied and exposed to the elements as her earthly form gradually returned to the base elements from which it was made. And yet, there were those in Yola who swore that the place where she was discovered had been searched repeatedly over the months she was missing. They remained convinced that the strange circumstances of the lady's disappearance, along with the perceived indifference of her family, suggest a darker fate. Whatever suspicions remained among Grandma Chase's neighbors, the coroner and District Attorney Dampier jointly determined there would be no need for an inquest into her lonely death. Case closed. However you met your fate. What happened to Yola and the families who lived there after the mystery of Grandma Chase was solved? On September 20th, 1907, even before Emmeline Chase's fate was known, her daughter-in-law Nettie gave birth to William Dell Chase, the last of her and Eugene's 4 sons. That would mean she had been 6 months pregnant at the time of her mother-in-law's disappearance. Could her condition have been a factor in the apparent friction between the Chase women? Anticipating a birth at age 41 in this isolated part of the country, with a husband who was seemingly often absent and 3 small sons to care for, her youngest was only 4 that summer, might Nettie have butted heads with Emmeline over the strain of having to provide for the needs of the older woman, with yet another mouth to feed on the way? We can never know. Sometime after 1920, the surviving Chases migrated west to California, where Eugene died in 1930 and Nettie followed him in 1946. Both are buried in Ukiah Cemetery in Mendocino County. Near the end of May 1909, a skeleton was discovered on the northeast corner of Section 14 in Lake George Township. Since the remains were found about 3/4 of a mile from the cabin where Frederick Seaford had lived, it was confidently identified as the elderly man who went missing the same summer that Emmeline Chase did just a few miles away. As for Yola, the logging industry in northern Minnesota had already peaked by the time of the Grandma Chase mystery, and while family farms filled the clearings left by departing lumber camps, Yola never grew to rival nearby towns like Bemidji, Park Rapids, and Akeley. It still had a post office in 1921, when a new postmistress was assigned there, and homesteaders were still proving up claims with a Yola address into the mid-1920s. But the little settlement never again knew the notoriety it attained that summer of 1907, and mentions of the place faded from local papers by the 1930s. It is designated as a populated place within Lake George Township today, and as of 2020, that township had a total population of 307. Visitors to the area and tourists of the macabre can book a stay at the Yola Lodge, built in that eventful year of 1907, which offers accommodations in cabins described as rustic, though surely not as much so as that tiny shanty in the woods that stood in June 1907, waiting for the return of a pioneer who never came home. And Grandma Chase? Her entry on findagrave.com contains no photo of a marker, no address where her earthly remains found a final rest, just burial details unknown. But there is a message for Emily left by a stranger. However you met your fate, you had many friends and neighbors who cared and looked unceasingly for you after you disappeared. And that, perhaps, is as powerful an epitaph as any of us can hope to mark our own passing. What do you think really happened to Emmeline Grandma Chase? Leave your theory in the comments. And if you enjoyed the story of one of Minnesota's cold cases, I hope you'll hit the subscribe button and check out my other Minnesota stories celebrating the history and people of the North Star State.